so much for being here tonight. Before we begin, let's get our interpretation feature going. So as you may see in the chat, I've already pinned the live stream interpretation links, and I'm going to ask our interpreters to introduce themselves and give directions on how to access the interpretation. We'll start with Ms. Lilith Termenjian.
Hello, my name is Lilith Termenjian, and I'm going to interpret into Armenian. Thank you very much.
Ms. Soyan.
안녕하세요. 손소연입니다. 한국어를 듣기 원하시는 분들은 옆에 그 링크가 있습니다. 그 링크를 조인하셔서 저희 한국어 통역으로 들어오시면 되겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Ms. Veronica Jenks.
Buenas tardes a todos los presentes. Mi nombre es Verónica Jenks y voy a proveer el servicio de traducción al español para poder escuchar la presentación de esta noche o de esta tarde en español. Por favor, entren al casillero del chat. Bajo mi nombre de Verónica Jenks está el enlace para entrar al canal para escuchar la presentación en español. Al entrar al enlace van a escuchar toda la presentación y ver la presentación en la traducción del canal en español. Gracias y buenas tardes.
Thank you. And Miss Margaret Sargsyan.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые родители и участники собрания. Меня зовут Маргарита Саргсян, я переводчик русского языка нашего школьного округа. Если вам необходим перевод на русский язык, пожалуйста, зайдите в чат и нажмите на ссылку, где указано на мое имя, и я с удовольствием переведу для вас это собрание. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Emil Ahangarzadeh, the director of our department.
Well, very fine. Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. And just the Martin for Hayren Petkonen, Katman Hayren link hoop the back, so first, I want to just give my hats off to our awesome gate specialist, Anita Arjoyan, who really works tirelessly to coordinate a lot of different things. And so thank you so much for all of your work, Anita. We want to welcome you all again, of course. Good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's Family Institute. Today's February 27th. It's a beautiful Thursday evening. I'd like to, of course, extend my gratitude to our participants, our speaker, Ms. Fonseca, we'll introduce in just a second, and of course, our awesome interpreters on this Google Meet call. I'd also like to establish some guidelines for tonight's presentations. Firstly, we want to ask everyone to just know that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted on our website, and that's where you can also see our previously recorded webinars. You can find those on the district website. As questions come up, we ask you to please type them into the Q&A feature, question and answer feature found at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentation, should the time permit, we'll try to answer all of your questions, certainly. Our Gate Family Institutes are intended as a family engagement and empowerment opportunity. The information that's being presented here isn't about district or site programming or gate regulations and things of that nature. If you have specific questions about that, you can reach out to your school site's teacher specialist, or you can reach out to the amazing Anita Arjoyan, who's our district's gate specialist. I also like to acknowledge that we're also joined tonight by Danielle Fox. Hello, Ms. Fox. Thank you for joining us tonight. She's another one of our experts in the field of gifted and talented education, and we're delighted that she's able to join tonight's presentation. But let's get to the meat of the show. We're thrilled, of course, again to welcome Ms. Christine Fonseca, our presenter tonight. We also extend a warm welcome to all the students and the families that are joining us. Tonight, Ms. Fonseca will take us through social emotional development of gifted children who are exploring deep existential thoughts and ways for them to balance. I think many of you who've joined us in these webinars in the past know, but Ms. Fonseca is a licensed educational psychologist. She's a critically acclaimed author and a nationally recognized speaker specializing in educational psychology, mental health and giftedness. And we're certainly grateful to have her here and to have her share her expertise with us tonight. So once again, thank you so much, Christine, for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here tonight. This is always the highlight of some of my weeks. And tonight we're just going to tackle big questions, and we're going to tackle what it means to kind of live from your strengths. And as we go through the presentation tonight, I'm hoping that you guys will get an opportunity to really walk away with some practical ideas that you can use at home. First thing we're going to do, I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me just one moment while I get everything set up. All righty. So I like to call this, well, first, let me check. You guys can see this, right? Somebody say yes.
Yes.
Perfect. I like to call this a focus on strengths tonight. We're going to use our strengths-based conversation to talk about big feelings, talk about some of the big things that come up for our gifted kiddos. You kind of already heard all about me for those of you who maybe are new and haven't joined. The thing to most kind of know about me is I'm a gifted adult. And as such, I just really define myself as an intense human. And as we're talking today about those big feelings and those big thoughts that come up for our gifted children, I really want to anchor all of that in conversations around these areas of intensity or overexcitability that our gifted children often possess, what that looks like from a strengths perspective, and what happens when we're maybe overusing some of those strengths to the point where they're no longer really functioning as strengths. And then within that whole conversation, we'll talk about how to balance our strengths, how to build strengths, and this will apply to these areas of overexcitability, but it also applies really just to different character strengths that you're seeing in your children. So one of the things I think about when I think about how I want to define intensity as it relates to giftedness is this quote that is from an article I did several years ago. And it basically says this: the intensity that commonly defines giftedness refers to how a gifted person approaches his or her life at its best, most developed attribute. The intensity is the passion that drives people to achieve, to produce amazing feats in a myriad of different domains. It's a modern day superpower, if you will. Now, at its most immature state, it's beyond the opposite of that. It is the very intensity that can cause turmoil, that can consume gifted individuals and create many of those self-defeating behaviors that you might see at home, and for our educators in the room that might show up in the classroom. And so really this is about learning to balance these things out and really mature some of these attributes through our social emotional learning skills. So as we start our conversation this evening, what I really want you to do is kind of think about the ways your child sometimes acts intensely over the last 6 months. Maybe it's in how they think about things. Maybe it's in the passion with which they pursue things that they're very much interested in. Maybe it's in their emotions. Maybe there's a level of intensity related to anxiety or different kinds of mental health conditions that you see. And I just want you to hold that in your mind as we're talking today and let that see what resonates with you. I often like to start with a kind of a little personal inventory. So as you're thinking about yourself, if you happen to be a gifted adult, but also if you were to kind of be working with your students or your children, or if there's any children on this call, think about different signs that your version of intensity might be a little out of balance. It could be things like experiencing stomach aches or headaches or body pains a little bit more frequently than you would like to be experiencing those. Maybe you're having some sleep disturbances. Maybe you're finding that your patience wears really thin these days, or you might actually be having some anxiety or panic attacks or panic moments. Perhaps your sensory system is on overdrive, so strong lights and big sounds are really bothering you. perhaps you're just annoyed by everything, or perhaps you're feeling like you're in a little bit of emotional distress, or maybe even emotional distress all of the time. Some of these can indicate to you that those intensities that come along for the ride with our giftedness might be a little out of balance, and it might be time to do a little inventory on them. So let's talk about those intensities and really kind of anchor ourselves in this knowledge of what I mean when I say this. We've gone over this in some of our previous sessions, but some of this bears repeating. So I kind of brought this chart back so that we can look at the 5 main areas of overexcitability, or intensity as I like to call them, talk about the features of them, and then some potential strengths and concerns, depending on how mature these particular strengths are and whether or not you have them in balance. So the ones we most often think about when we're thinking about our gifted individuals are our intellectual overexcitabilities or intensities and our emotional intensities. We'll take the intellectual one first. That's defined as being a really intense problem solver. You have the capacity to concentrate for long periods of time, particularly in preferred activities. You might have very kind of detailed visual recall. And really one of the defining features of a gifted student who has intellectual intensity is just enjoying learning for the sake of learning, kind of that insatiable curiosity. Now, all of this sounds really good. It is a defining aspect of what it means to be gifted. And some of the strengths that really show up with this are things like being innovative or a quick thinker. Maybe you have a strong memory, and many, as you know, of our gifted kids tend to be strong learners. That doesn't always mean they are successful at school, but they do tend to be strong learners. Now, when these things are out of balance a little bit, or maybe a little bit more immature, that same student who's so good with their memory or has that real potential to be a quick thinker may also wind up with some really underdeveloped social emotional skills and processes, and maybe some increased threat awareness due to that really strong ability to analyze their environment really quickly. That can lead to some potential problems later on. In our emotional domain, emotional intensity refers to that incredible, passionate approach to life, where we have extreme emotions that are often complex and layered. We might have strong reactions to our emotional status or our emotional state. And they also have the ability to develop really deep relationships. All of this sounds really good. And when it's well balanced and there are strengths, we call these things resilience or a zest for life or empathy and compassion, all of which are such important skills in our world today. But when our emotional intensity is not developed the way we want, it can also result in a few other things. Having some difficulty with emotional distress, for example, or becoming enmeshed with others and other people's emotions. We also might have some difficulty with developing some of those thinking skills because we might be kind of showing a preference for our emotional intensity over our intellectual intensity. And that can result in maybe a little less what we call cognitive regulation, or that ability to sustain mental effort and mental focus for long periods of time. Might also result in underdevelopment of what we call theory of mind. And theory of mind is this abstract concept of social awareness, where we as human beings develop an understanding that I am one person and you are another person, and my needs and rights and emotions might be different than your needs and rights and emotion, and both are important, but they're not the same. And that's just something that kind of we develop as human beings over time. And for our gifted kiddos, sometimes that area, if we are over-reliant on our emotional kind of side of the house, that part of who we are may experience some underdevelopment. We can talk about what those problems look like in a little bit. I started with intellectual intensity and emotional intensity because these two areas are present pretty much in every gifted human. These are defining aspects of what it means to be gifted. But there are 3 additional areas of overexcitability or intensity that might also come into play. And so we'll take a look at those as well. The first one is psychomotor intensity. Kids with a high level of intensity in the psychomotor domain often move for the sake of moving and speak for the sake of speaking. These are kids who tend to have very animated speech patterns. They really like to take action. They learn best by doing, and they might even be a bit of a risk taker or a little bit of an adrenaline junkie. In terms of the strengths that this can produce, it'll often be things like being innovative, being action-oriented, being a strong orator. And you can kind of see I kind of messed up these 2 columns. I apologize for that. But these things right here that are listed under potential concerns, those are actually areas of strength, right? We can combine our physical skills and our oration skills, and our areas of concern, and I'll correct this slide before I give it to Anita to distribute. But our potential concerns in this area are often things like, we'll act first and think a distant second. So we might put ourselves at risk, or we'll favor action over contemplation, and we might get burned out or have some really uneven development. We might even be more prone to developing certain types of emotional distress as a result of this. In our sensual areas of intensity, this is referring to the sensations that come in through our 5 senses, our hearing, our vision, our sense of smell, our sense of touch. And kids who have strong sensual areas of intensity tend to be highly impacted or influenced by their sensory stimulation around them. They have a very strong sensory memory. So not only will they remember an event, but they will remember the sights and sounds and smells of that event also. They also, though, tend to have a strong appreciation for the arts and a great appreciation for beauty and nature, and really kind of that ability to experience a sense of wonder or awe. Many of our kiddos, if this is an area of strength for them, they have incredible detail-oriented awareness of sensory details within the environment. They pick up on subtle cues, microfacial expressions, things like that, really fast, which might even make them appear almost as though they're intuitive. Unfortunately, when this is underdeveloped, this can also become a threat kind of a thing. So they can often become very hypersensitive to the environment, to the point of having kind of this real imbalance, and they start kind of perceiving danger around every corner. This can be particularly true if they've had a negative experience with something. So let's say they had a negative experience at school. They might overgeneralize that because of their heightened awareness of things and start seeing that similar experience everywhere, which can lead to increases in things like anxiety and panic attacks and things like that. So it's just, these are all, think of these as continuums, right? Like these are all things that there's good things when it's well developed, and there's not such good things or potential concerns when we're still working to develop this particular aspect of what it means to be gifted. The last area of intensity is your imaginational intensity. And these kids most gifted kids are pretty creative, but kids who have strong levels of intensity in their imaginational domain tend to have really strong daydreams and evening dreams. They tend to be really imaginative and creative, and they'll often turn to imaginative play when they're stressed or bored. From a strengths perspective, this can lead to strong resiliency or being creative or being innovative. But when this area is not well developed, or if we have some like unbalanced with this area, we also, again, might misinterpret threats within the environment. We might become imbalanced in the way our empathy develops. We might struggle with some enmeshment with others. And so it's really important to know that, this is all about learning how to develop those social emotional skills to balance everything. But it starts with a strengths perspective in general. So what do I even mean by that? Well, part of developing a strengths perspective is learning to change our language with how we refer to things. Oftentimes in our frustration, we might refer to some of our gifted kids as, a little bossy or a little bit of a know-it-all or those kinds of things. And what we need to do is take a look at that and say, what is it that they're showing me really from a positive lens or a strengths perspective? Bossiness in that case would become leadership. Stubbornness, our gifted kids can get stuck, right? They can get really stubborn about something. That's really just a version of perseverance. Perfectionism, which we've spent a whole other section talking about, is really another term for high performance standards. Sometimes our gifted kids come across as continually worrying. That's really just being empathetic. They might demonstrate excessive questions, so much so that it drives you as a parent a little nutty, or it drives an educator a little nutty. That's just an indication of curiosity. And being over emotional is really just a sign that they're incredibly passionate about what it is that they believe in and what it is that they're thinking about. Now, having a strengths perspective is really important with our kids so that they don't take some of the more difficult aspects of their intensity and turn them into a problem, right? Define themselves by the negative aspect of it or the underdeveloped skill that it represents. And so taking a strengths perception is super, super important, except when it's not. Sometimes in our effort to have a strengths-based approach, we start ignoring very real situations within the environment or within a system that works the opposite of our intent. So I just want to call these to your attention. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I could do a whole lecture on kind of when a strengths perspective becomes problematic, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. One, if the strengths perspective you're taking fails to acknowledge the existence of a very real problem that your child is experiencing, that's problematic. We don't ever want to gaslight others by making them question how they're defining their own experiences in the world simply because we're using a strengths-based approach. So for example, if a student has decided because they, consulted Dr. Google maybe a little too often, and they're very stressed out, so they've decided to label that as stress, we don't want to minimize what they're experiencing and defining as anxiety, right? Like we don't want to minimize that. At the same time, we can start to help them learn to discern. Is it that you are anxious all the time? Is it inhibiting your ability to function, or are you really stressed right now because of something that happened? And what would happen if we let go of the story of you're anxious? Are we defining ourselves that way? Because anxiety is something that happens to us, but it's not us, right? And so learning how to have that kind of a conversation that can help them move towards being strengths-based without ever diminishing the reality that they're experiencing is really, really important. This is particularly true if trauma is around at all, if there's some traumatic events happening within the household. And this includes not just historical trauma or adverse childhood experiences that your student may be experiencing, but this also includes kind of the larger systemic trauma that can happen from a child's experience at school, a parent's experience at school, and those kinds of things. So we never want to use our strengths-based perspective, nor am I advocating for us to ignore very real pain that people are feeling. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these because it kind of captures what we just talked about, other than to say, I really want you to think about your intensities in each of these 5 areas as a pendulum that can swing in any one direction. The idea is to keep it in balance, right? So we want to keep it so that it's kind of in the middle, right? So that we're getting the best of all worlds. If we overuse an intensity, then that can be problematic, just like if we underuse an intensity. This also applies to our character strengths. If we overuse a character strength like kindness, that can become problematic, believe it or not, because then you might get walked on. You might subjugate your own needs for the needs of someone else. That would be an example of overusing kindness. But if we underuse kindness, then we might just be being mean, right? Then we're prioritizing yourself over the collective whole. Both of those are problematic. So the idea is to just be in the middle. So when it comes to our areas of intensity, I just kind of want to highlight what these overuse and underuse models are for these areas of intensity, so you can kind of develop a little picture in your mind and use that picture when you're working with your child and you're trying to help them balance things, right? So intellectual intensity, that's all about love of learning. If we overuse our intellect, we come off as a know-it-all. And when we are, in fact, acting from a like I know everything perspective, we lose out on the opportunities to learn something new. We actually have to remember that there are things in this world that we just don't know. And if we can stay open and curious, then we can learn more. But if we adapt this mindset of, I already know all of this. So take a third grader sitting in a third grade classroom. Maybe they're incredibly gifted. Maybe they know a lot of the content. They may sit there and say, well, I know all of this. I don't need to pay attention. And then they might lose out on opportunities that the teacher has presented for some extended learning, for some new perspectives, just opportunities to see the world in a different way. That's an overuse. Sometimes our gifted kiddos underuse their intellect. They're really, really bright. They, for whatever reason, it doesn't feel safe for them to demonstrate that. And so an underuse of intellectual intensity is going to come off as complacency. They're not going to do anything. They're not using that big, beautiful brain of theirs. With emotional intensity, that's all about love and passion and having a zest for life, right? Overuse of emotional intensity kind of looks like emotional promiscuity. That's when you are kind of dumping your emotions on any human being that will listen. Actually, you're just dumping it on everybody, even if they won't listen, and you're just an emotional mess all the time. That's somebody who's overly dependent on their emotional aspect of who they are, and so they're not balancing that out with any kind of reasoning skill. When we underuse our emotional intensity, we tend to put ourselves in emotional isolation. We might dissociate from our emotions and kind of not acknowledge our emotions. And the truth of the matter is human beings are delightfully messy, and we have delightful emotions that we can experience all the time, and they can really add a lot of richness to our life and enable us to develop resiliency skills and problem solve, but not if we're over or underusing them. And so we have to kind of find that sweet spot in the middle so that things stay in balance. With our psychomotor intensity, that's all about that enthusiasm for life, that talking for the sake of talking and moving for the sake of moving. As you probably already guessed, if we overuse psychomotor intensity, that can look like being hyperactive. Right? We're constantly moving. We're never sitting still. It's like we're trying to outrun the world. And that can become problematic. It's really difficult to develop relationships, and it's really difficult to develop our social emotional learning skills if we're constantly on the move. If we underuse this area of intensity, if we ignore it altogether, then we're overly sedentary, which is just as problematic as being hyperactive. So again, it's always about finding that balance. With our sensory system, that kind of what's the core of that is kind of that appreciation for beauty and seeing life around all things and being able to decipher our environment really, really well. If we overuse that, that can come off as perfectionism, actually. It's a really interesting thing when you start seeing people overuse their sensory pieces and overuse their dependency on their senses, and it can really start looking almost like perfectionism, and underuse then can look like oblivion. And then finally, with our imaginational intensity, the kind of the core of that is our creative being. Overuse of our imagination leads to really eccentric behavior, and sometimes that can further isolate us from others, where underuse of our creative imaginational parts of us as gifted humans can lead to a level of conformity that negates innovation altogether. And so when you have kids who are dealing with these big ideas and these big thoughts and existential thoughts, which can happen as a result of imaginational intensity or our sensory intensity or our intellectual intensity, and most particular, our emotional intensity. When this is occurring, it is most likely some sort of over or underuse of our skills that throws them amok. Now, let me kind of couch all this by saying it is normal for our gifted humans, even when they're really, really young, to deal with the big questions of life. Who am I and why am I here? What is the point of school? What's going to happen to me if there's some sort of traumatic event going on at home? What's going to happen to me if I can't make friends? These are really big questions. Sometimes they may even have bigger questions that have to do with the meaning of life and my purpose within the life, right? They might become, especially as they're in later elementary school and middle school, they might become hyper aware of world events or big causes, things like climate change, other kinds of big things that are happening in the world. And that might cause a variety of emotional responses that can feel very overwhelming. This is where that balance piece is so important. And this is where developing their strengths is so important. So let's talk a little bit for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to some questions about how we can deliberately strengthen both character strengths and these areas of intensity that we've been talking about today. So developing strengths is a real thing. There's a whole scientific study on what happens when we develop strengths. And one of the things that we've noticed is kind of two really important features. And this research was not done exclusively on gifted children. This is research that was done across a broad spectrum of both children and adults. And it's really looking at what happens when we identify one's character strengths and we actively try to develop one's character strengths. And character strengths can refer to those areas of intensity, but it can also refer to things like kindness, love of learning, appreciation of beauty, those kinds of things. And so what they found in the research is, first and foremost, we can increase academic performance by 20 to 30 points, which is a lot. It's very rare that you can have something that increases academic performance like that. And developing one's strengths, calling one's strengths out, doing some of the things we're going to talk about today, both at home and at school, is a proven way to improve a student's connection and performance within a school environment, which is amazing. Even more amazing, however, is what it does for us in our social emotional selves. We know from very recent research that developing our strengths can decrease episodes of depression and anxiety and increase our sense of happiness by 20, 30, 40% and more. That's huge. That's amazing. Again, these are things that all of us can do, and it's actually not as hard as you might think. So the first thing I want to talk about with regards to this is something called signature strengths. Signature strengths are those strengths, character strengths that we have that are kind of our go-to signature strengths. So there is a website called VIA, V-I-A, strengths. So if you were to Google VIA, V-I-A, character strengths, there are quizzes that you can take that kind of rank you around 24 identified strengths that are throughout history have been identified as important character strengths and, you know, have existed across multiple cultures, multiple kinds of backgrounds. And it's just character strengths that human beings have been found over history to possess. If we take that quiz, you will find 5 or 6 at the top that we consider our signature strengths, a whole bunch of them in the middle, and then about 4 or 5 of them at the bottom. And those 4 or 5 of them at the bottom are ones that we call underused strengths. So it's not that they're weaknesses. I don't want anybody to think of it that way. These are just things we don't tap into maybe as often as we should. But let's just focus on those top 5. Those signature strengths increase happiness, decrease anxiety and depression, and can be developed and can be strengthened. So one of the ways that I think is so powerful that we can strengthen our signature strengths is by using them in a new way. So let's say, for example, one of our signature strengths is justice. We have a just mind. We're always noticing when groups of people maybe are being treated unfairly or whatever. That's a strength for us. If we find a new way to use that strength, we actually increase our capacity with that strength. Let's take it in terms of our gifted kids and areas of intensity. Let's say that somebody has a strength in their imaginational intensity. If we find a new way, a new kind of endeavor that they can use their innovation and creativity with, that's going to increase their capacity to use it in general. If we can connect goal-directed behavior, doing your homework, doing your chores, getting into the school you want to get into, those kinds of things, goal-directed behaviors. If we can put a connection between that behavior that we want from our child and their signature strength, one of those strengths, then we can, they'll be more willing to do that goal-directed behavior, but we can also increase their capacity to use that signature strength. And we want to do these things again because we're going to improve resilience. We're going to balance out that kind of balance that we need so that they're not hurting themselves through kind of overuse of any of their strengths. Another way that I really, really like to use strengths is by what's called strength spotting. Now, what's powerful about this is we can do it for ourselves and we can do it for others. When I work with students, I teach them how to do it for others first. A common way of doing this, and we can do this as parents with our children at home or as teachers in our classroom, is there's a variety of different strength surveys that you can use. The VIA one is one, but there's others. And you basically get kids to take, figure out, learn what their signature strengths are. And once they know, we share that with every member of the family. And then we're kind of like CSI workers on a hunt to see if we can catch that person using that strength. And when they do, we call them out on it. So one of my favorite examples was a woman that I did some consulting with. I consulted in her district, and she was in a director position, and she and I were going somewhere. I can't even remember where. And I knew what her strengths were because I had done this with all of my clients. And it was something simple. We're driving down the road and she noticed that a person was trying to cross a crosswalk that wasn't, it didn't have a signal or anything. And there was just a lot of traffic. So she stopped so that that person could cross the road. And I called her out on it. I said, oh my gosh, you just demonstrated such great capacity for and empathy for someone else. You really recognized that this person had been waiting a long time. What an awesome example of your strength. And it just made her whole day. But here's the other thing that it does. It gives her capacity to do it again. And what the research says is she's more likely to spot somebody else's strengths if we do that. Now, our brains are funny, funny things. We are hardwired to notice what's wrong, what's a problem, what's a weakness, what's a deficit. We are programmed to see all of that first. That's the part of our brain that is our threat center. We'll always do that. To counter that, because if we only focus on what's wrong, right, we're just going to see more of what's wrong, and then we're going to feel really bad about ourselves. And so a counter to that is doing this strength spotting. Constantly trying to catch when you're demonstrating your own strengths, constantly trying to catch when other people are demonstrating their strengths. I do this in my life just all the time. I'm so used to teaching on this subject that it's just part of my vernacular now. And when I pay a compliment to somebody, it tends to be really tied with their strengths. I really like strength spotting, and I highly recommend it with kids. Excuse me. Using strengths in innovative ways, making a commitment, for example, to kind of use your strength in a way that's different. This can be something you guys talk about at home in a family meeting or over the dinner table, and then kind of challenge each other to see if there's a new way you could do it. If your child is particularly creative, what's some new creative thing that they can do that they've never done before? Not only are they going to build capacity in their creativity, but they're going to build some new neural pathways. And doing that, by the way, is going to help prevent that overuse of their intellect. Because if they're doing something new, it's not something they've mastered. It's not going to be comfortable for them. So they're going to build some tolerance for discomfort. They're going to have to build new neurosynapses, new neural pathways to be able to do it. And then they start to adapt a little bit of a beginner's mindset, which for a lot of our gifted kids, that was not such a bad thing because many things in life come really easy for them. And then strength spotting, this is kind of a detailed example of strength spotting. When I do in-person workshops, we actually take some time and I walk participants through how to do this. I encourage you, when you get this handout, go back to this slide. You can see exactly how to do it with others. You can take a look at this. There are strengths questionnaires you can get online, but this will just give you all the same questions that you can ask yourself. And these are active ways that we can begin to build our strengths. Probably the most exciting area of research for me as a psychologist and somebody who practices a lot of different wellness and somatic kind of work is the idea of mindfulness growth and strength. So I want you to just think of mindfulness as a really simple thing, and that's just being in the present moment. That's it, just present moment awareness. That's all it is. And so the idea with mindfulness and strengths is learning how to be within the present moment without judgment, being curious about that, utilizing our self-regulation skills so we can focus in on one thing, and then expanding our awareness so that we can see multiple perspectives of things. And if we can do this in relationship to our strengths, not only do we improve our capacity for perspective taking and self-regulation and curiosity, but we also improve the specific strength that we're thinking about. And these can be done in simple 1-minute exercises, 30-second exercises. It's probably the easiest way to start is to just tuning into your own body. So when you feel yourself getting really stressed, when your child is telling you that they're really stressed from school, or you're seeing it on their face when you pick them up from school, have them tune into their body just really briefly and say, okay, what is your body feeling right now? And let them tell you that. I don't know what my body's feeling. Okay, ask your body, what are you feeling right now, body? And your kid's going to think you've lost your mind, but it'll work. and your body will answer you. I'm feeling like I need to stand and stretch. Okay, we're driving in a car, so we can't do it right now, but maybe we do it right when we get home. We'll stand, we'll stretch, and then you can tell me what else your body is thinking. These kinds of things where we're really just focusing in on one thing and we're learning to do it in a different way enhances our strengths, balances our intensities, and then gives us a skill set for resilience that provides a blueprint to resilience. Life is full of obstacles, right? Even for our gifted kids. They face different things that are really hard. One of the neatest things that we can do when we're teaching kids about their strengths is an understanding that every strength a human being possesses, all of those 24 character traits, every human possesses all of them. Yes, there are a bunch we don't regularly use, and so it's hard for us to use them. They're not our go-to strengths, but that doesn't mean we can't tap into them. It might take practice. We might have to try. Like one for me, I'm usually very good at grit, but you know what? If I'm a little stressed out, my perseverance might be lagging a little bit, but it might be that I've got a task that I need to do that I'm just not good at. It might be a skill set I haven't learned. It might be something that I get really frustrated with really easily. I'm going to need that perseverance to help me do this thing. And so by calling that out and saying, okay, how can I practice be persevering? Can I sit with this task 1 minute longer than I did yesterday? Will my body help me do that? This is how we develop our strengths that maybe we don't use very often. And this is also how we develop resiliency. And it's how we start balancing all of these things out. All right. I'm going to end with just kind of asking you to think about your kids again. On one of those first slides, I said, think about the ways in which your kids are really intense, how those intensities have manifested. Once you have that in your mind, I want you to think about what's a negative thing that I've seen from their intensity and what's a positive thing that I've seen from their intensity. Really lock into that. Once you have that, what strength are they showing me through that? So maybe they're emotionally intense. They're just ridiculously emotional all the time. Okay. The negative thing with that might be they're really, really emotionally volatile. They cry. They don't particularly show strong resilience. They get super, super emotional when things don't go their way. A positive thing about that is they might be really passionate about stuff. Like they really, really care about things. I don't have to tell them to care about things because they just do. All right. So what strength might that deep caring be connected to? Maybe it's a zest for life. Maybe it's feeling passionate about justice, like we mentioned before. Try to figure out what it is, and then how can they use that strength to help when that emotional intensity is showing up in a negative way? Is there something in that strength that can help them reframe that, move that needle a little bit? As you think about those things and reflect on those things, I want you to commit to one thing. Maybe it's strength spotting. Maybe it's just a conversation. Maybe it's a little practice of mindfulness. Maybe it's that centering in on your body. But just find one thing that you're willing to try with your student or your child within the next, say, 3 days, assuming you're around. Assuming there's not 400 other things on your plate, but at least over the weekend, right? What's something I can do? What the research tells us is when we attend things like this, if we don't use that information in 48 to 72 hours, we're probably going to lose that information. So we want to try to practice the skill. And if you can't think of anything with your kids, try to think of your own strengths. How can I do this personally in my life? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can get to any questions that we may have. So let me turn this off. Let me stop presenting. There we go. And do we have any questions? Are there any thoughts anybody wants to share?
We have Bruno Miranda.
Excellent.
Hello. Thank you for.
Hi, Bruno.
Thank you for the great presentation. I do have one question for you, Christine.
Sure.
So you went very, very carefully through a lot of the long-term strategy we're dealing with the kids in terms of finding the right balances, identifying the strengths, managing all that conceptualization by the kid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my question is, there's going to be some moments that the kid is going to enter into overwhelming situation. Sometimes I call it the hole, where anxiety is kind of through the roof, and we may even call it a panic attack. And when the kid is in that situation, a lot of these techniques can still work, because you can see that these kids will be still very rational and they want to understand exactly what's going on. But when the kid is in that particular situation of not having the right posture or the right calm to address it, in what way would you change your recommendations on how to deal with that situation? So I'm basically shifting your long-term strategy, which makes total sense, to just short-term.
Immediate. What can I do in the immediate?
In what way should we change it, and what's the best thing to deal there? Of course, physical security will be like the first thing that comes to my mind, but much more to that. So I'll just want to open that little door so that you could share a few thoughts.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you guys an acronym. The acronym is ROAR, R-O-A-R. This is my go-to myself when I'm losing it or when I'm coaching others when they're in a state of overwhelm. So the first R stands for relax. That is the very first thing that needs to happen. And you can do what's called co-regulation with your child by helping them learn to relax. Stand with them. Ask them to match your breathing, for example. That can slow down their breathing, which will cause a sense of calm. There's something called butterfly taps, which is this. It automatically puts your body into a state of calm by activating your parasympathetic nervous system. Those kinds of things can help you relax in the moment almost instantly. Nothing can happen till that happens. The O stands for orient. Here's the funny thing about our panic attacks and our anxiety attacks. They're pretty much always happening in reference to a sense of overwhelm from something in the past or something in the future. And so when we can orient to right now, here and now, and the breathing will help with that, the tapping will help with that, that can also go a long way to helping get us to a state of calm in the immediacy. Then we attune. What do you need right now? If I have a kid who's really, really overwhelmed, I'll get them calm enough that they can answer this question, and I will ask them, what do you need right now? And really work with them to have an answer. And then we release. We're going to let go of everything else that's happening right now. We're going to take care of what you need right now. We're going to let go of everything else. And once the child is all the way back down and really in a much bigger state of calm, then you can tackle whatever the bigger issue is. But you don't want to try to tackle that bigger issue when they're really dysregulated, because they're not going to remember a darn thing you say anyways. The brain doesn't work that way. Hopefully that helps.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
You are very welcome.
We have another parent, Eric. Forgive me for mispronouncing if I do. Siok?
No problem. Quick question. Could underachievement due to lack of effort or passion or focus be a characteristic of a gifted child?
Yes. So here's the thing with giftedness. We all assume gifted kids do really, really well in school, except about 40-ish% of our gifted population does horrible in school. And 9 out of 10 times it is a mismatch between the learning environment and what the child needs. And sometimes it's a child who has not yet been identified for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they're twice exceptional, meaning they might have a learning disability and be gifted. They might have autism and be gifted. They might have ADHD and be gifted. And oftentimes that's the student most at risk to not being successful within a traditional learning environment. As we in school districts move more and more differentiation and trying to meet the needs of all learners, regardless of label and all of those things, a lot of this stuff starts to iron out a little bit. But yes, underachievement, lack of motivation, all those things can absolutely be a sign of giftedness. Anything else?
Gotcha. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes, and the Q&A feature is also available too if you're someplace where you can't unmute yourself. And while we wait, I did want to highlight, I always connect here.
I love that you do.
I can't help it. I was thinking when you're identifying a strength in someone else, especially for the littles, probably the ones who aren't identified as gifted yet. I'm thinking kinder first, even preschool. It allows them to find the words, right? For like this, and put to words what they recognize.
Yep.
And then if we have like negative self-talk, for example, or we have a child who is really hard on themselves, and being able to identify strengths in someone else, and then they see those strengths in themselves, I think it does wonders for their self-esteem. I think that's awesome.
It absolutely does. And yes, our gifted kids can be brutally hard on themselves at times.
And I'd like to add to that, with the whole imposter syndrome and just using the word, oh, you're so smart, you're the best, you're the smartest, giving that very specific feedback of, oh, I love how you colored that butterfly or whatever it is, instead of, oh, looks great, you're so smart. That gives them very specific ways to reflect on their work, and also specific ways to move forward. So yes.
I lovingly refer to that as positive performance feedback as opposed to praise.
Yes, because, when they get older and things aren't so easy automatically for them, then they can tap back into that specific feedback and say, okay, well, what can I actually dig into to accomplish whatever task they're struggling with?
Yep. And that ties back beautifully said. That ties back to the idea of using one's strengths, or the collection of humanity's strengths, when we need to overcome an obstacle.
Thank you. Bruno Miranda.
Thank you. So one more question.
Sure.
Way too good of a topic to let it go. Here's one. You talk a lot about, Christine, intensity, right? Mm-hmm. And here's one that I struggled the most to manage with kids is the social relationship with other kids, right? Yep. Because in one way, I think sometimes it's better just don't get into it. Because you cannot expect the other kid to go with the same intensity, because things are going to burn, right? So you have to respect that from the other kid. So you have two alternatives in my mind. One is disengage a little bit and just don't engage as much. But you cannot do that too much, because you need to be working with society and with everybody around you. The other one is engage, but they understand where the line is for engagement and for efficient engagement with many people around you. How to think about that balance, Christine? And how do you go left? How do you push a little bit to the left? How do you push a little bit to the right? And depending on the situation. So any framework?
Well, what automatically comes to mind is perspective, right? And really working with perspective taking with our gifted individuals, especially when they're young. Because you have to remember, to a gifted kid, everybody's just like they are. Everybody's this intense. So when they're not, they're like, what do you mean they're not? I don't get it. My favorite example is take a bunch of second and third graders. Your second grade Gifted Kiddo has been finally asked to go play tetherball. So like any self-respecting gifted kiddo, they spend all night reading the international rules of tetherball so they can play it correctly. And lo and behold, they go to play tetherball and nobody is following the international rules of tetherball. But why would you ever play a game and not play it right? So they explain ad nauseum the international rules of tetherball, and needless to say, a typically developing peer wants nothing to do with them after that, which causes the gifted human incredible pain because they don't understand what they did wrong. Because from the perspective of the gifted kid, they didn't do anything wrong. It is a mismatch of expectation. That's all that it is. And so the easiest way to help kids learn that, all kids, is through different kinds of role-playing and perspective-taking games so that we can learn how to play all different kinds of roles. And we can understand that human beings are incredibly diverse and show up in a myriad of ways, and all of it's okay. And the trick is trying to figure out how to learn the other person's way of dealing with the world and then how to mesh that with your own and turn it into a game. And with that, I know it's time, so I'm going to be quiet now, Anita.
Thank you for the questions. All right, so with that, I want to thank our interpreters. As always, they are here to support all of our families. I want to thank Ms. Danielle Fox for making an appearance, and Ms. Fonseca, as always, thank you so much for the information. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you so much.
A good night.
Anita, I'm going to send you the handout. I'm just going to fix that one slide.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. I'm going to stop recording.